Data strategy is really about understanding the gaps between what the business needs and what we're currently offering, and then really finding the path to close them. So success wasn't about building the right platform. It was about getting agreement on what mattered and building shared momentum toward that future. One of the first hurdles was helping the business learn how to spot a good data science use case. So my boss at the time used to say, if it quacks and it has feathers, it's probably a duck. And he wanted to know, what's our duck test for data science or for AI? So we had a couple criteria that we put together that helped him and other senior leaders start to hone in on where there could be opportunities. So the three criteria were:
Hey, everybody. Welcome to Beyond Brilliance, the podcast where we dive deep into the minds of leaders who are shaping the future of business and technology. I'm Jay.
And I'm your co host, Rahul Mohan. I'm a senior consulting executive with over 2 decades in the consulting space. Today, we have someone truly special with us, Deb Barnes, who recently founded Stellara Strategy after an incredible 17-year journey at USAA, where she led enterprise-wide data transformations worth over $50 million in AI-driven efficiencies.
And what makes Deb's story so compelling is that she didn't start out to become a data executive. Her path was a curious kid asking tough questions. And I don't know how she became a de facto CDO just being that, right? So, Deb, welcome to Beyond Brilliance. And for the first segment, we wanted to talk about your foundation and early career. Let's start from the very beginning. What first sparked your interest in data, systems, or even problem solving for that matter?
Well, thank you for having me. I'm really excited to be here. And you hit it the nail on the head earlier with I was a curious kid. That's exactly right. I asked a lot of questions, often the ones that made adults pause. And sometimes that endless why, we've all heard that from our kiddos. It was interesting, even as I went on through school into like the high school years, I had lots of friends who had, real passion projects, right? Big into music or big into theater or cars or math or whatever it was. And I just never really had that. For a long time, I started to think, am I just really scattered? What's going on with me? But after some time, I did realize it's actually, I just really like learning. I like to figure things out. I like to be challenged and try new things that I haven't tried before. And so that made me on the outside appear scattered, but on the inside, just a love of learning is really what drove me as a kid. And I think also throughout my career. So that mindset, curiosity and drive to understand followed me through school, into my career, and ultimately into leadership.
That's a powerful lesson about following your curiosity rather than having everything mapped out. That's amazing. So now one thing that really stood out from you for me from your journey is that you started in market research and customer insights. You started your journey from there. So how did this customer focused beginning shape your approach for analytics later on?
Yeah, I'd love to tell you that story. It was another moment of curiosity leading me. Before starting at USAA, I did a PhD in information systems, and everything I did there was very quantitative, model building, game theory, optimization. And I thought I was going to go into academics and be a professor. But when it came down to it, I did interview at this industry job at USAA for a qualitative research position. And ultimately, I decided it was that curiosity that got me again. I'm going to go for this new thing. I'm going to learn it. And I liked the idea of really solving problems that are going to then change a business. So when I did customer insight, it was really a great training ground for a career in data, all kinds of data. And I think more modernly, we think about unstructured data a lot more than we did at that time. But kind of pairing together that quantitative background with focus groups, surveys, I did lots of one-on-one interviews with the members of USAA, and I learned a lot about, how to interact and how to really listen for understanding. Data is not just numbers, it's people, it's their behaviors, their fears, motivations, and values. When you're doing customer research, you learn quickly that what people say and what people do rarely match. I won't even say don't always match, rarely match. So, you start triangulating on what's really happening and connecting the dots. And this really influenced how I lead analytics today, that triangulation, that looking for the do versus the say, in every interaction that we had. I think also having spoken personally to so many of our members, often talking to them about really challenging situations, it helps you really keep top of mind that, we need to do something about what we're learning because people are being impacted, positively or negatively based on what we're doing or what we're not doing. So that, what are we changing has stayed with me through every role since then.
Got it. And that human element is so crucial. Can you share a specific moment with customer data directly influencing a big business decision? Something that really shows this people first approach in action?
Absolutely. So, one of the first projects I worked on at USAA, so this was 17 years ago, was something called mental modeling. And it's really just trying to understand how customers think about an event that they're going through. And in our case, we were trying to understand life events, really important for financial services. All of our products are geared around life events, really, and the financial things that you need at that time. So things like you're moving, you're buying a home. In USAA, our customers were primarily military, and so permanent change of station was another variation of moving. So we'd interview like 8 or 10 members and really have them, we charted out step by step. What was that? What are you thinking about? What resources do you need? How does that feel was also an important part about it. When they had done it last time, what do they wish had been different? Those kinds of things. And one of the hardest ones that we worked on was losing a loved one. That is a really hard time in a member's life. And those interviews were incredibly tender. We were speaking with someone who had agreed to talk to us about what it was like for them when they lost their loved one and, what they were having to do on the financial side of the equation as well. They had to relive, what happened, but the insights were really helpful through the tears. We had to take breaks. It was a really, really human side of a corporate job of a bank and an insurance company that maybe that's not always what you think first and foremost about. But people were not talking about life insurance the way we did internally. It was not a product or a process. It was like that last act of love from their loved one. It was a gift from them from after they had passed. And so it really helped us improve our communications. We have a group called the Survivor Relations Team that's really specially tuned into this life event. And it really reminded me that data, brings us back to what really matters.
Thank you, Deb, for sharing that moving story.
Yeah, thank you, Deb. That was an incredibly powerful story there, turning data into empathy and then into action. We want to dive into your work building USA's first data science function. Can you share with us what were some of the biggest hurdles when you faced when you were launching that?
Yeah, that was extremely fun, first of all, and it was extremely messy also. It was a space that we were new to. We'd done applied analytics and other types of statistical analysis, but we weren't really putting those things into production in the way that you do with AI, ML, and data science. We had to build a shared understanding of what data science really was, when it was useful, and how to make it stick in a business that was already operating at full speed. One of the first hurdles was helping the business learn how to spot a good data science use case. So my boss at the time used to say, if it quacks and it has feathers, it's probably a duck. And he wanted to know what's our duck test for data science or for AI. So we had a couple criteria that we put together that helped him and other senior leaders start to hone in on where there could be opportunities. So the three criteria were there are a lot of people doing the same task over and over again, and they're needing to choose between options. That was important because the decisioning needed to be in there versus just a basic automation that could be done. There's a ton of data involved, right? Too much for a human to process quickly. That's another great opportunity or potential. And then for us, the practical side of it was also there's already funding or a transformation effort underway. So we're not doing what we would call a science fair project, right? We're really trying to help the business solve a problem they're already after. And then here are some characteristics of the kinds of things we can usually help with. So there were other hurdles on both sides. We needed the data scientists who had this great technical expertise, and we needed them to have that business understanding. And we needed to coach our business partners too to, stop throwing AI at every problem. It's an exciting tool and we wanted to use it, but there were a lot of situations where much simpler solutions were available and much less risk involved in managing. And so both sides of the story both sides of the players had to learn a little bit of the other teams and then come to better understandings together. So by doing that and working together and educating each other, right? Not just saying, hey, you need to learn about data science. We built credibility, and also solved those real problems, not science fair problems, with the right tools.
That's great, especially the duck test. That was brilliant. Such a practical way to identify real opportunities. Now, you delivered several tens of millions in AI-enabled efficiencies. Can you walk us through one of those major use cases?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. One of the ones I like to talk about the most is in our call center. So I was in the banking division at USAA, and of course, we are a digital only bank. So we have digital presence, we had the mobile app, and then we had our call centers that handled member calls. Something that we had seen happening in the call center were we ended up calling complex calls, but what was happening were these calls were much longer than the average call and had to go to several customer service representatives, right? So they had to hop around in order to get their problem resolved, which isn't a great experience for the member, right? It's like, oh, I can't help you with that, sir. Let me pass you on to somebody else. And so immediately that first handoff is like, this is not great. A second handoff is, oh man, am I still waiting for these people, to figure it out? So it looked like a customer experience opportunity, an efficiency opportunity, and an employee experience opportunity as well. So what we did was we built a routing model that mapped members with the right agent. So we had more information about what that member had been doing, online or right before that call, and tried to match that member with a multi-skilled agent that could likely handle, all aspects of their call. So that small change had a very big effect. It reduced transfers, it improved resolution time, and it boosted customer satisfaction. And the employees benefited too. There was less frustration. You're not getting that customer on their third transfer who's coming in already kind of irritated that it hasn't been figured out, rightly so. And it saved millions of dollars. I mean, so in the end, these complex calls were maybe, 10 or 15% of our total call volume, but we dramatically improved those handle times. So probably by about 50% on that subset. And overall, we improved our handle time by 3 or 4% as a part of this project, which means efficiency, which means shorter queues, people waiting for somebody to talk to, less costs in total to serve that member's need that day. It showed the business that AI wasn't just a tech buzzword. It was a practical tool that could improve outcomes on multiple dimensions.
That's great to hear. Honestly, as a USAA customer for over 15 years, I think I can attest to that amazing customer service that they provide. But such a great example of AI solving real problems. But I imagine there were also misconceptions about AI that you had to overcome. What were some of those biggest challenges that you had to overcome?
I mean, often it's a silver bullet, like, oh, it can just figure everything out. And I'll share with you, this was not in our Gen AI days, right? This was about 10 years ago, or no, maybe 7 years ago when I was doing this work. And so this was really we were just getting enough compute power on where we could actually do this kind of large data processing. And so half of the battle is that the data is right and that the data is well organized and that we can actually interact in the environment where we want to, right? The actual operational environment. That was all new stuff to the analytics team. Typically the analytics team was back office and we did the analysis, we provided the results and insights, and then we were done, right? And then the business asked us the next question. Well, now we were integrating something into the tech stack. It had to get certain types of data. It had to, be resilient and function in the right kind of cadence. So there was a lot to learn, right? It wasn't just, oh, now we have AI, we can just do it, right? I think there was a perception of a much more plug and play than what the reality was.
For this section of our segment, I wanted to talk about executive leadership and the transformation that you've championed in USAA. So, setting realistic expectations is also so important. Like in our corporate setting, you want to set realistic expectations. Now, let's talk about your transition into a chief data officer role. It was probably a very critical time in which you actually stepped into that role. What is the first thing you had to tackle when you stepped into that position?
Yeah, so when I stepped into the role, we were right in the middle of a regulatory storm. Data quality had been flagged, governance was fragmented, and everyone was waiting for someone to take the lead. So the first thing I tackled wasn't just a technical problem, it was an organizational one. Ownership. Who's going to solve it? Maybe the first most important question of any effort. So we needed to clarify who was responsible for what, for data, process, technology, and risk. And I built a new ownership model that helped make data accountability crystal clear across business, tech, and control partners. We didn't rip out, what was already happening. We were just working to align and clarify. And that alignment helped us get a lot more momentum, right? We weren't pulling in different directions. We now kind of knew each of our roles and what we needed to deliver. At the same time, we needed to move fast. We were trying to fulfill some regulatory expectations. And that meant we needed to build our framework, but also immediately drive improvement, right? So we couldn't spend all of our time in framework and ideals. We needed to also show we're putting things into place that actually either improve the quality of data, reduce our risk, or what have you, but right now, not eventually. So we had that dynamic of do now, build framework in parallel that can sometimes make things a little bit difficult. Excuse me. So ultimately, we were able to drive quite a bit of quality improvements, in particular around a subset of critical reports. So we scoped down what we were going to improve using a risk-based lens, saying, okay, these reports go to our board or the regulators or their regulatory filings. So very important to get them right. And we'll kind of try out all of the elements of the framework there. Ultimately, we did get a thumbs up from our audit team. It wasn't glamorous, but it was essential, to restore trust and set the stage for continued progress in our data and analytics strategy.
Got it. And that sounds incredibly challenging. You had to deal with the regulators, board pressure, fragmented data governance. And how do you measure success when you're leading such a big, large transformation like this? You're tasked to do the enterprise data strategy. How do you measure success with a program like that?
Yeah, so for me, data strategy is really about understanding the gaps between what the business needs and what we're currently offering, and then really finding the path to close them. So success wasn't about building the right platform. It was about getting agreement on what mattered and building shared momentum toward that future. That meant aligning priorities across tech, business, and risk teams and sparking conversations about where we're headed and what the priorities were. Some of the questions that have started were, are we ready to handle unstructured data? Do we need more control around our external data feeds? What analytics or reporting pain points we're slowing people down? And some of these things, like I mentioned, the business need would rarely be, I need more control around my external data feed. But if their business deliverable depended on those external data feeds, we as the data team had to make sure we were putting in those table stakes components, right, all along the way. And then when generative AI hit the scene in the last, 2 years or so, it gave the strategy a lot of energy. So suddenly people who hadn't been thinking about data quality or architecture were now paying a lot of attention. We used that momentum to pull unstructured data management into scope, make stronger cases for data cleanup, and tie foundational work to Gen AI use cases so that leaders were excited about. So again, our data strategy lining up to the business strategy and success measured in delivering those capabilities.
Got it. And that's a smart way of using your emerging technology trends to drive your foundational improvements, right? That's great. So those years of leading under regulatory pressure and board oversight must have taught you a lot about leadership. So what learnings were there? I mean, what did you learn in that high intense pressure situations? What leadership lessons did you learn during those times?
Yeah, more than anything, those years taught me the importance of grit. When you're under a consent order or audit spotlight, the pressure doesn't come just from outside, it builds inside the team too. The workload is very intense, the timelines are tight, and the stakes feel impossibly high. You're just creating a whole pressure cooker situation, not only for you, but for the entire team that you're leading and for all of your partners that you're working with. So as a leader, you really have to keep showing up. You have to keep delivering, but you have to know when it's time to pull your team out of the fire for a minute and give them a break. Protecting the team doesn't mean shielding them from the hard work, but it does mean making sure they're supported and they're enough to sustain the hard work, right? If your team gets burnt out, they're either going to leave you or they're going to not perform as well. They're not going to have the energy, to continue to do that quality output. So I also had to learn how to carry that stress without passing it all down, right? When we were getting feedback that maybe wasn't so great, making sure to not translate that concern or that stress to the team while still giving them the information they needed for us to course correct. You don't have to be perfect, but you do have to be calm, clear, and committed to progress. And more than anything, you have to be really available to your team and keep opening the door to them to come to you, to share concerns, to ask questions so they feel safe, to share with you when things are getting too tough.
All right. That was some powerful advice about protective leadership. Let's move into our final segment here, reflections and advice. So looking back, if you could give your younger self one piece of advice before you stepped into this executive leadership position, what would it be?
Yeah, I would say speak up sooner. There were times early on where I had the right instinct, but I held back. Maybe because I wasn't sure it was my place, or I didn't want to seem too bold, speak out of turn. But the truth is, some of the best outcomes I've seen come from surfacing uncomfortable truths at just the right moment. So I tell myself, my younger self, your clarity is a strength, not a liability. And leadership isn't about waiting your turn. It's about being brave enough to say something that moves the room forward. And on the flip side, sometimes if it isn't the right things to say, just take that feedback with grace and move on, right? That's okay. Move on. We'll be fine. So
Absolutely. That's excellent advice. Now, there's probably a lot of misconceptions about what it's like to be a senior data executive. What's one misconception you'd like to correct?
that it's all about the technology. It is rarely about the technology on a day-to-day basis. That the architecture matters, but if you think being a senior data executive is mostly about picking platforms or building dashboards, you're really missing the point. The job is translating. It's getting people across the business to care about the same data point for the same reason. It's about trust, timing, and making hard calls when things aren't aligned. And at this level, success is rarely about, the model. It's about the momentum that you create.
Absolutely. That's such an important distinction. Now, you recently founded Stellara Strategy that's focusing on helping community and regional banks. What's driving that mission, and how does your approach with smaller banks differ from the work you did at USAA?
Sure. Everything is more personal. The relationships, the way change happens is different. So, community banks aren't chasing market share or, building moonshot labs. They're trying to serve their communities better. They're trying to protect their members' trust and stay competitive without losing what makes them special. So that means the solutions we need to bring have to be right sized. No cookie cutter playbooks, just smart human centered ways to reduce friction, improve visibility, and help their teams get more out of the day they already have. I found these partnerships to be incredibly meaningful. The stakes feel higher in a good way because when we get it right, the impact shows up fast, not just in operations, but in people's lives.
Absolutely. So, as we wrap up, what advice would you give someone who's just starting their journey in data and analytics, and someone who might be like you, curious but not sure where exactly all this is leading?
What advice to someone just starting in data and analytics? Well, I would say data and analytics is more about business than it is about data and analytics. So being really good at listening and understanding the business partner and the problem that they're sharing is the place to spend your time. You bring your tools and your skills, absolutely. But the way that you have real impact is by truly understanding the problem and spending time on that before we start to bring our tools to it. So that would be my advice. Get really good at listening, practice it, practice asking more questions and being curious, because that's where the great, people go from good to great. You can have a really well qualified analyst who is providing information to their business area, and then you can have someone who's thought of as a thought partner, and that's what we're trying to get to, those thought partners. So that would be my advice.
That's great advice. And finally, real quick, what do you see as the biggest opportunities in data and AI over the next few years?
Ooh. Well, it's interesting. So if I think about at the enterprise scale, it's going to be much more about getting scalable solutions of generative AI, right? How do we get that to really work while protecting information, while making sure that the legal ramifications of any generated information is handled well? So I think it's really going to be about tackling the enterprise's complexity so that we can use Gen AI. On the other hand, for small businesses or community banks, like who I'm working with in Stellara Strategy, it's going to be about not being afraid to try things. When you have a lower complexity environment that these banks or small business owners have, there's a ton they can do right away, right now, to improve their efficiency, make that toolkit for their existing employees stronger, and they can move fast because they don't have that complexity that the enterprise scale does. So I would say there it's like about trying, adopting, and changing quickly so that you can get a set of tools in place that will really work at that small business level.
Deb, this is absolutely fascinating. Thank you for sharing your journey with us and all the practical insights that you've shared in this episode.
And for our listeners who want to connect with Deb or learn more about Stellara Strategy, we're going to have all the links in our show notes.
Thank you for listening in to Beyond Brilliance. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe and leave us a review.
Until next time, keep pushing beyond brilliance.
I'm glad you mentioned authenticity as well. You got to be yourself. You got to be true to yourself. It's hard to be a truly different version of yourself at work. So as much as you can truly be yourself, do. And if you can't, really think about why. What's holding you back. In fact, if you're waiting to feel ready, you'll wait too long for sure. I have certainly made that mistake more than once of waiting too long to kind of take that step forward. I would say yes before you have it all figured out. It's okay to be figuring it out as you go. And step into that room even when you feel underqualified. I mean, the truth is probably we are all our harshest critic, and what you have to say has value, and starting to say it will just help you practice and become better at that over time. Also, find your people. Leadership can feel lonely, especially the more senior you get in an organization, but it doesn't have to be. Build your circle, ask for feedback, offer it to others, be visible and be generous. Those combinations open doors, not just for you, but for women, coming up behind you. I want my legacy to be about showing up fully, clearly, and without apology, because your voice, your real voice, is the one that people will truly remember. For customers, I want to leave behind systems that feel intuitive, helpful, and human, even when they're powered by AI. And for banks, I want to be remembered as someone who helped modernize the right way, strategically, thoughtfully, and without compromising what made them trusted to begin with. For future leaders, don't shrink yourself to fit the room, be the one who changes it.